Thank you very much. We have another microphone somewhere. So are there any questions? And the microphone will come to you if you put your hand up in the front. And I'm going to share my microphone with this. Oh, good. Okay. Oh, and if you'd like to introduce yourself as well and keep questions precise.
Okay. My name is Ian McQuone from Sustainable Business Design. I've got a question for the gentleman from Armstrong. Sorry, was it Jeremy? Wonderful. So I advise SME manufacturing businesses on sustainable business models and helping to get their products more sustainable. And I'm interested to know how accessible do you think the cradle-to-cradle certification would be in terms of resource and cost to a smaller business?
Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Bear in mind that cradle to cradle is a product standard. That's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing is that cradle to cradle is not just building materials. So, for example, I mean, you probably know this, but Stella McCartney very recently has a range of clothing. I'm not sure if she started with T-shirts or jeans, which are, I think, platinum. And C&A also has a range of clothing, and then there's a whole range of cosmetics, detergents, children's toys, stationery, and so on. So I think that the cradle-to-cradle product standard is a very engaging approach because it's across the economy. And if you can start with consumer products, then I think you can migrate it across to building materials, which is pretty much what happened in the Netherlands. So I like the standard for that reason. It is quite tough in the sense that you need to break down your material into 100 parts per million. You need to declare the contents down to 100 parts per million, or more if you can get it down to 1,000 parts per million. That's very difficult to do. And then having done that and you figured out which are the bad bits, you've then got to have a process that gets them out. So don't undertake it lightly. It is a tough standard to meet. So I think if you've got SMEs that have got are using materials that are either bio-based or they've designed them in such a way that they haven't got the bad stuff in them in the first place, then I think that's a very good start point. And I think that would definitely give a competitive advantage.
Thank you.
It probably is quite expensive, though, for a small company to do, or it's a big undertaking.
It's about 5,000 euros, so it's not a lot, and
Okay.
it depends how broad you break that product category. So actually, that's not. It's more about time. But then there are plenty of good consultants out there that will help you and advise on the best way to do it. And it may well be that this is something that ought to be done at an industry level or a trade association level, for example. That could be another way of approaching it.
Okay, great question. Thank you. Any more questions? Architecture or design or a materials question? Unbelievable. I was one. Oh, we've got one. Okay, fantastic.
Hello. Hi, my name is Aidan. I'm from Natural Building UK. I had a question for Ehab, actually. I was hoping he could elaborate on the plant-based concrete and what properties of concrete are you trying to kind of replicate with this plant-based composite?
What we're trying to achieve is a like-for-like replacement of concrete, and the way we're going about it is if you could come to our stand and look at the samples of orb that we've got at the moment. Orb is made out of an organic binder which is derived from all natural natural sources and waste sources as well, and mixed with agricultural waste. We're looking at about 20 to 40% binder and 60 to 80% waste, and the way we're developing that into a plant-based concrete is we're using more agricultural waste streams that are inherently fibrous and much stronger, where you get the strength from. Things like hemp work really well, and in terms of the binder, we're changing the recipes in order to achieve the load-bearing qualities of concrete that are comparable to current industry standards. So right now we're able to we're half the way there, and we're working towards making it happen over the next 2 years. It's very much a trial and error process, and it's not an easy route. So we're just going to try and work towards making it as strong as possible, and we've designed the construction system that would allow us to use something that may not be quite as strong as concrete yet.
Okay, thank you. Very exciting. More questions? Yes, up the back.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentations. My name's Andre Miller. I'm from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Perhaps I shouldn't, but I wholeheartedly agree with the comment that government can't necessarily lead on this, but can it at least help or at least not hinder? And what should it be doing?
I'll answer that, but I guess there are lots of other here that can also. So I'll just give my perspective on it. I think there are building regulations which can be very effective. So I think the government has a role there. For example, I'm thinking just purely for the UK, but it could be outside of the UK. I think the government as a procurer, if you like, I mean, they're responsible in the UK for about 40% of all spend in the construction industry. It may be higher, I'm not sure. So clearly the government is a client, local authorities as well as central government, so they have a huge role to play there in terms of setting standards. So I think it's those sorts of things. You've got to find the right mechanisms that are going to catalyse change. And I think when you go at the very high level, although I applaud things like the climate change agreement, it's just too long. It takes too much effort for too many people to make a very small change. So I think it's finding mechanisms at the sort of day-to-day practical level that can have an impact, and I would certainly applaud those initiatives. But as I say, others may
I'm
have.
sure. Anybody else like to comment on that? I know something that drives a lot of architects crazy is that if you build new, there is no VAT on your materials, but if you're renovating, retrofitting, you're paying VAT. So, where they were trying to encourage more housing to be built, the unintended consequence of that is that perfectly okay buildings get demolished and destroyed so that they can build whatever they want without paying VAT. And that's a little thing that could literally be changed by Treasury tomorrow. And that would be a game changer, in terms of us not wasting materials and existing buildings. And it drives me mad. And I'm not even an architect, and it drives me mad. But who else would like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I've got two possibilities. When it comes to the images that we're using, we use these to really think step by step, what does it mean if we want to gain this situation, and what does it mean for the different roles? What can we do different, and what do we need from the government? So that's the way how we use it. And through the discussions, I hear a lot that the taxes on the materials should be raised, while on labor it should be the government should make it less, so that we can really take care that remanufacturing and repairing, that it becomes cheaper. Well, that's at least for the Dutch situation. I don't know how it is in the UK, but probably
Sweden removed VAT from repair about 2 years ago, and that is entirely to encourage people to keep goods and items in circulation and not to discard them. And that's a meaningful incentive for average citizens. It's ridiculous that it's cheaper to buy a new pair of shoes than it is to resole the ones you've already got. So, yeah.
I just want to say that regulations and standards and policies could be an amazing driver for innovation and a shift towards more sustainable futures. But at the same time, it can also be one of the biggest barriers when you're developing completely new materials that do not conform with current material standards. We're facing a huge barrier with that with our insulation, for example, because all of the insulation standards are built for plastic-based insulation, and all of the tests are testing how toxic the insulation is. Ours is completely natural, and there are no toxins in there, and in order to test that, we're having to work with BSI to create a whole new standard that takes into account how bio-based materials are able to be tested. And that's quite a dilemma. And again, waiting on government does take so long. For example, on looking at waste management, government-led waste management organizations, we've had to go straight into the private sector and just collect the waste straight from them as product in order to get around the whole legislative barrier around collecting waste or working with waste management firms. It's been a really difficult process. So I do completely empathize with what you said.
I think we had a speaker yesterday from Amsterdam who was saying that the government there has set out they must be a circular city by 2050, like completely, 100%, everything, every aspect of transport, building, education, food, and they have targets that have been set by the government, and that gives citizens and businesses, corporations something to work towards, and it's kind of meaningful, it's there, and you can't avoid it. So it kind of gives them a focus. I mean, I think we have a lot of moving of the goalposts in the UK, right? So we set things up, and then a couple of years later we change it, or we just drop that ball. And I know that happens at local authority level a lot as well. I mean, I've written loads of policy and strategy for Brighton and Hove City Council. They just forget to put them into action or refer to them, and 5 years later they'll go to refresh the document, and I just say, why don't you just do what's in the document instead of refreshing the document? So, there's all sorts of crazy stuff that goes on. Andre?
Yeah, I was going to say a couple of things. I mean, I think it picks up really on what you've been saying, but actually some long-term strategy of where we want to get to probably would be useful, because I'm sure the reason Brighton and Hove Council don't implement these things is, one, policy keeps changing, two, they've no money to do it.
Yes.
And so there's a big question about to what extent government wants to govern in a particular way rather than be completely hands-off. And I think from certainly in our area, this facilitating sort of top-down and bottom-up engagements would be good, but that probably happens at a municipal level, which probably means local authorities would need more funding to facilitate things like that, because at the moment that is a critical problem in a lot of these kinds of problems, at least here. And then two, the other thing is actually putting food at the center of lots of policy, which is discussed elsewhere. But that's quite interesting because it also again touches on so many different activities. So, I mean, those would be three things from our area that would be useful.
Yeah, just about this legislation question. I think in the Netherlands it is very helpful for us that the government can create kind of pilot status for a project, so that we have some regulation space for experiment. For instance, the smart grid and people having solar panels trading energy is actually not allowed, because then you would be an energy firm, and there's only a couple of big firms that are allowed to do this. But within this pilot status, people can actually test out these things, and when you have these places for experiment, you can set precedents, you know, and if it works, then you can scale it up.
Yeah, so I think when things like that go on in the UK, it's just really because of passionate, crazy maniacs. Yeah, it's not because we actually have a formal space to operate in. It's just people like Ehab and myself who just defy really what's going on, because we want everything to be different, and then you hope that that's successful, and then the big guys come in and adopt it or take it on a bit more. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be waiting for the government if we want to get anything done, but I think they could definitely stop hindering us, would be awesome, and give some money to local authorities, because then they can work really closely and collaboratively with people. So we've got to wrap up in a minute or two, so there's time for one more question.
Given that it's a question from the BAS, the government does have policy examples which have had a good effect and positive effect. By mandating that government contracts and procurement needed to use the BIM standards, for example, that had a very positive effect, and it certainly affected all the major contractors. What has become the challenge is to filter that down. The supply chain. Now, one of my clients is a BIM specialist. They do 3D laser, all that stuff. But actually, it's the smaller contractors treat it as a cost, not an investment. So the whole way you account for change has to be put into perspective. If you're investing in what's necessary for the adoption of BIM, which also has a reduce on rework on and waste effect, you need to account for it not just for the first project, but for a longer time scale to make it an investment. Otherwise, the returns don't always come just from the first project. And the government needs to recognise those in their policy directives to enable people to take it up and account for it better.
Because it's too costly for very small operators. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. A point well made. Could we just have a round of applause for our fantastic speakers, please? And thank you for being a lovely audience.